What's up, guys? This is Mr. S,
And Mr. McGregor.
and we're going to be talking about evolution in a little more depth today, talking about some various concepts. Coevolution. So, coevolution is the idea that things will evolve when organisms put pressures on one another. Now, when the pressures that are being put on each other cause evolution to happen, those are called evolutionary pressures. So one organism evolves one characteristic because another organism is forcing it to. Now that's different from the evolution we had been talking about earlier in the ways that it's usually like intraspecies competition causing things to happen, and it's an evolution where organisms that are best adapted for that environment are surviving and those that are not are going away. In coevolution, it's kind of random in which one organism, either it's hunting it or the other one's trying to avoid it. They evolve these weird adaptations to kind of outdo one another. And the first one we'll be talking about is predator versus prey. So as I had been discussing, predator versus prey coevolution is when the prey evolves certain adaptations to avoid the predators, the prey being the one that usually is falling victim to the predators. So like in the case of a bird and an owl, the owl would be the predator because it's eating the bird, who is the prey. And then the predator evolves adaptations to catch that prey. So the prey is evolving adaptations to avoid the predator, and then the predator evolves its own adaptations to catch the prey. Some examples would be the moth coloration that occurred in the 1800s during the Industrial Revolution that was occurring in England at the time. And eye placement on animals is another type of adaptation that has occurred both in predators and prey. And then we will be talking about malaria and sickle cell anemia. Just a note, the anemia has kind of shifted, so just kind of write it in as we have right there. Focusing on moth coloration and how this is coevolution, we are just going to be talking about the evolution of the moths. Now, the moths, the predator-prey situation here, where the predators were birds and the prey was moths. Now, before the 1800s, there was many of these white birch trees. So the white birch trees are, as it kind of makes sense, they are white in color. And what was the natural way in which the moths were being born was roughly like 95% of all moths were white in color. And it makes sense, right? If they're 95% are white, you'd expect most of the moths to be white because they are hiding on the white tree right there. And any moth that is born with the dark coloration here is going to be exposed. And so if you were a bird flying over these white birch trees, the moth you would most likely kill and therefore erase its genes from the gene pool would probably be the moth with the dark coloration right there. Now, after the Industrial Revolution had been going on for a little while, they were using mainly coal to power all their machinery. While using coal to power all their machinery, coal burns really, really dirty. So all that soot from the burning coal would come out of the smokestacks and actually fall upon these large swaths of forests, and it actually turned the color of the trees dark because all the trees were essentially painted with this coal dust. What eventually started happening is naturalists would notice that the numbers of the moths turned more like a 50-50, where 50% were white and 50% had that dark coloration. Okay. Now this is an example of coevolution because eventually what was happening was, since the trees are now dark in color, all the white moths were exposed and the birds were picking them off, eating all the white moths, so their genes were being deleted from the gene pool. But what was doing really well with these now dark colored forests were the black moths. And so their numbers started growing, and the dark color was now starting to be added more and more to that, gene pool of the population. So over time, within this time period, you have the creation of all these, or you have the expansion of all these dark colored moths and the reduction of white colored moth. And over time, eventually, people stopped using coal as much, and the trees went back to white. And what would you expect the color of the moths to have turned again? So hopefully you realize that the moths would have gone white. So once again, this is predator versus prey, because the prey is evolving because the predators are essentially selecting against, in the case of the white trees, it was selecting against the black moths. And when the trees were black, the birds were selecting against the white moths. So it was the birds that are actually changing the population. So this is why it's predator-prey. The next one will not be just so focused on the prey alone, but also include the predators.
So another example of predator versus prey coevolution is the adaptation of eye placement on the hunters compared to the hunted. Now, eye placement is kind of defined as the distance of your eyes apart from one another or their physical location on your head. And eye placement does one of two very important things. The closer your eyes are together, the better your depth perception is. And depth perception is kind of like your ability to locate something's distance from you and grab it as need be, or to kind of be able to see what's ahead of you. You use depth perception a lot. I know a lot of you are learning how to drive right now. It's really important for that, to figure out how far something is away from you, to stop. And you can actually see how this binocular vision, it's called, with your eyes closer together, affects your depth perception. If you just try covering one up right now and reaching for something in your vicinity, you'll realize you have a harder time doing that with just one eye than you do with both of them. The other thing, the other type of eye placement we're talking about is more of a kind of panoramic vision. So the farther your eyes are apart, the wider your range of vision is, but the worse your depth perception is. The reason eye placement is important in these predator-prey coevolution partnerships, essentially, is that the animals that are being hunted are going to want that more panoramic vision, that wide array, that wide range of vision, so that they can see what's coming around them. And the animals that are doing the hunting are going to want that binocular vision so that they have better depth perception, so that they can catch the animals that are trying to run away from them. So if you think about it, if you were being chased by cheetahs on your way to the school bus every morning, would it be more important that you have great depth perception or a wide range of vision? Hopefully you answered a wide range of vision on that one, or panoramic vision. So to illustrate an example of how this would force evolution to occur, let's say that Alec has panoramic or wide range vision and Paul has binocular vision. Well, while Paul is busy looking at his fantasy football team on his phone, Alec is already on the run from the bus stop cheetahs. Whose genes are going to get passed on? And for some reason, sometimes you guys don't listen to everything we say and you skip forward and just fill in the blanks. So we know you're paying attention. Right now on this slide, I want you to draw this figure with binocular vision and label it as binocular vision. And this would be the predator. And then we also want you to draw the prey with panoramic or wide range vision. And remember this, because we're going to ask you to do it again on another slide later to make sure that you're paying attention to all of the amazing things we have to tell you.
And the homework tonight is going to be about how predator-prey relations have actually caused humans to evolve. The predator being mosquitoes and the malaria protozoan that is carried in their stomach, and the prey is actually us in this instance. And you will find that homework assignment on the Google Classroom. You'll be watching a movie, and there'll be a question that you could just answer on Notability, and then post that to the Google Classroom. Okay, so another type of way evolution kind of works, another mode. So we've had natural selection, we've had coevolution, cause things to change, and now we have sexual selection. Sexual selection, as you might imagine, has to do with genders, and this is the evolution of characteristics that allow one animal to mate more successfully. So if you have these characteristics, you can mate way more. And remember, since fitness is not only surviving, but it's actually having lots of babies, because the more babies you have, the more genes you pass on, the higher the chances you will cause the population to evolve over time. The more babies you make, the more genes you pass on, so you are therefore more fit. Now, this normally happens to males, and it's usually the females causing the males to evolve. In the picture below, this is a peacock, and here is a peahen. The peahen is a female, the peacock is a male, and the male, they're actually the same species. I mean, they look really different. The peacock has this giant tail with this blue body because that's just how the females like it in that species. So if you have these exaggerated features, you mate way more than a man who has, I don't know, maybe they have a very pale blue body, or maybe they have very small tail feathers. In this species, bright blue body, giant tail feathers, you have a whole bunch of babies. In the case of the bowerbirds, this is again sexual selection. In the other instance, the peacock had, its body was the thing that had been changing, and the female liked his exaggerated body. Well, in the bowerbirds, the female actually doesn't really like his body so much. You can tell he's just a dark black color. She likes his behaviors. And if his behaviors are making a giant exaggerated nest, she likes him. She likes him even more if he adorns it with a variety of like blue ribbons or a variety of shiny things. I mean, it really depends. And that is actually how the males are more fit. The ones with the most exaggerated bachelor pad essentially gets the most females. You'll notice, and actually in this species as well, the females tend to be just kind of like a brownish color. That's because the females are the ones that usually have to lay the egg. They usually have to sit on the egg the longest, if the male is involved even at all. And so the male doesn't really offer that much effort into actually rearing the babies. So the female kind of is like, okay, if I'm putting this much energy in, I need to make sure my male is extremely beautiful or his behaviors are really special. But for her, she kind of wants to stay a brown color so she doesn't, get caught by a predator and eaten. So she kind of stays brown to, it's called drab, to kind of camouflage herself. But the male, he's usually pretty much conspicuous to any predator at the time.
So sexual dimorphism is when different sexes look or act differently from each other. Now, this is sort of associated with sexual selection, but it's not so much a matter of choice of the females selecting the most fit male. It's more that the males are trying to fight to prove that they are the most fit and win the rights to the females. So what you end up seeing a lot of the time is males that are twice the size of the females because they're competing with one another for the rights to that female. And the female ends up mating with the most fit male, but it's one that's been fighting against another really fit male. And so you end up getting really gigantic men in a lot of these situations. Now, there is an example where in arachnids, where the female tends to be the larger, and that's because when they are mating, they frequently will cannibalize their male partner. They make a flash judgment whether or not that he is more worthwhile as a mate versus a source of nutrition. And a lot of times, because of that continually happening over time, the sizes are disproportionate, and females are a lot larger than the men.
And just to kind of bring it around with the sexual dimorphism thing, the main thing with that sexual dimorphism is just saying that males and females look drastically different from one another. Now, all species do not have sexual dimorphism. In the case of humans, we actually do not have sexual dimorphism. Males and females, though maybe we feel like, males are a lot bigger or different looking than the females, we're actually relatively the same size. On average, the average man is roughly the same size as the average woman. The male is larger, but not by that much. Compare that to the silverback gorilla, who is roughly 700 pounds, compared to the female, who's roughly, a little over 400 pounds. That means he's pretty much twice the size of her. And that's because sexual dimorphism usually exists in species where one mate is kind of in charge of the offspring. Humans, because we do not have sexual dimorphism, is clear evidence that humans are actually both supposed to be taking care of the offspring. Many other species are the same way. Many types of birds, you can't tell the female and the male apart, and that's results from the fact that both the female and the male are both in charge of taking care of the offspring. So sexual dimorphism, it's not in every type of species. On the screen right now, you are seeing a couple species that it does happen in, though. Okay, so we are officially done with evolution as far as testing material goes. So just to use this slide to kind of bring up a couple main points about evolution, you have the four main types of evolution here. There is natural selection. So this is a type of evolution that is caused by competition among species in which the most fit is the one surviving, and the least fit is not. So the least fit genes kind of disappear over time, and over many generations the population changes because the most fit genes are being passed on and the least fit genes are not. Then you have artificial selection. This was the one that humans do when we do things like domesticate dogs, or any type of farm animal we had talked about in class. So it's humans who are choosing which genes are passed on and which are not. And then you have, we'll go with coevolution next. And coevolution, this is a type of evolution in which two separate species, sometimes two or more species, are putting what is called evolutionary pressures on each other, causing evolution to occur. So, for example, in the moths, the birds were putting evolutionary pressures that were getting rid of the black moths and only keeping the white moths, and vice versa in that scenario. Then we had sexual selection, and this is a case in which the females usually are causing the evolution. Not in all scenarios, but it's usually the females that choose certain traits in men, and the men without those traits, they don't die, they just don't reproduce. So their fitness is very low because they are not reproducing. And then the evidence for evolution. So as far as the things that show that evolution is happening and continues to happen, you have, we'll start with convergent evolution. And convergent evolution is the idea that organisms develop the same body adaptations because they live in the same environment. Now, the organisms do not have to be related to each other or near related to each other, such as in the case of flight, in which insects fly and so do birds, and they're not really that related to each other. But since the environment, the correct adaptation for that environment is having wings, they have both evolved wings. So this is showing that the environment causes things to evolve, puts those evolutionary pressures on it. Then you have the fossil record, and with the fossil record, this is just showing organisms changing over time. So in the case of the snakes, we showed the skinks, right? You could actually see in the fossil records that lizards were further down in the rocks, and there were no snakes. And then over time, you'd see that the bones of the skinks are getting smaller, the front leg bones and the front arm bones are getting smaller, until finally you have the appearance of snakes. And then you have DNA. DNA is the ultimate number one way to show evolution. So make sure you remember this one. Okay, DNA shows what organisms are related to which ones by way of the genetic code. So chimpanzees and humans, how do we know they're extremely related? It's in the A, T's, C's, and G's of the genetic code. Over 97% of their A, T, C's, and G's are the exact A, T, C's, and G's in the DNA that we have. Then there is homologous structures. Homologous structures, they are structures that organisms who are related still maintain. So in the case of whales and humans, if I said a human and a whale is closer related than a human and, let's say, a iguana type of lizard, you'd be like, well, the whale looks extremely different from that human, and the iguana, I guess, would look more human-like. But if you broke down into our arm bones, you could actually see that the arm bones of the whale and the human, amongst other bones, would be more similar than the bones within the iguana and the humans. And so this is showing that whales and humans had a closer relative to each other than humans and iguanas, for example. And then embryology, this is showing that most vertebrates look very similar within the womb during developmental stages. So as fetuses, humans have tails and they have gills. And why would that be? Well, because the fact that humans, we are descendants of fish, and so we maintain some characteristics of fish. And you could even compare the embryo of a human to the embryo of a turtle and see that those look very similar because, once again, common descent.
Thanks for joining us today. This is Mr. McGregor.
And Mr. S.
And we'll see you now.